Hi, I'm Dan Snow. Welcome to this guide to Kenilworth Castle, one of the most spectacular palaces and castles in the British Isles. It's 900 years old, and many of the most important moments in British history have been played out in the shadows of those walls. Here was one of the toughest sieges in our history. It was one of Henry VIII's favourite castles, and it was the place where Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, made his final play to win the heart of Elizabeth I. But Kenilworth began its life as a formidable defensive stronghold. Built from local sandstone, Kenilworth stands in a naturally strong position on a rocky knoll. Surrounded by marshes at the beginning of the 13th century, King John created a large lake called the Mere using a dam. This was a formidable barrier to attack. In the 14th century, the powerful nobleman John of Gaunt turned this from a defensive stronghold into a palatial royal residence. It was taken a step further by Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, in the 16th century, when he created a palace fit for a queen for the visit of Elizabeth and her court. It continued to be used by the royal family until after the Civil War, when Parliament slighted the castle. They ordered its walls pulled down so it could never again be used as a royal stronghold. In 1244, King Henry III granted Kenilworth to Simon de Montfort, but he soon emerged as the leader of a group of rebel barons that fought to try and restrict the power of the king. After a civil war, Simon was killed in 1265, and his son promised to surrender Kenilworth to Henry. But when the king's messenger turned up and asked for the keys, the defenders chopped his hand off and sent him packing. A garrison of 1,200 men shored themselves up behind these walls and put their faith into one of the strongest castles in the land. From the top of the strong tower, you get a great view of the surrounding countryside and where the attackers would have been positioned. King Henry was furious that the rebels refused to surrender the castle to him, and so in June 1266 he began a formal siege. But Kenilworth is a very difficult castle to lay siege to. It had an impressive outer curtain wall, probably built when the castle was refortified in the mid-13th century. And Lund's Tower and Mortimer's Tower further enhanced its defensive capabilities. It was surrounded on many sides by a man-made lake, or the Mere, and other places it was very marshy. This made it impossible to burrow under the walls and collapse them and storm the fortress. Henry really used the only tactic available to him, which was to place siege engines on the high ground there and there, out of the range of the arrows of the defenders of the castle. Siege engines would throw huge stone balls into the castle to try and break up the defences, some weighing as much as 300 pounds, and archaeologists have actually found some of the stone balls in recent excavation. Despite this incredible battering, the defenders held out for 6 months, one of the longest sieges in British history. They only finally surrendered in December 1266 when they faced the prospect of starvation and were down to their last 2 days of food. This massive keep is the oldest part of the castle and the bedrock of its defence in times of war. People could also live in it during peacetime as well. The first 2 stories were built in the 1120s at the very foundation of the castle, and King John added another story on in the 1200s. Notice the fish-tailed arrow loops. They were an innovation of this period designed to accommodate the use of the crossbow. Inside the keep, you really get a better feel for this massive building. During the 12th century, the keep was probably the main residence of the castle, with a great hall occupying the top floor. There would have been a huge roof spanning about 30 feet with access to all levels via spiral staircases in the corner of the rooms. From here you get a great idea of just how thick the walls of this Norman keep were, in places about 4 metres thick apparently. And then also just how narrow these little arrow slits were. And it would have been very dark down here, and that's one of the reasons that subsequent generations enlarged the windows. In order to survive a siege, every garrison needs a secure source of pure water, and that's why in the corner of the keep there's a well. When John of Gaunt carried out his magnificent renovations here in the 14th century, he built this huge kitchen, more than 20 metres that way by 10 metres, separated from all the other buildings to reduce the risk of fire. It could have fed several hundred people and was twice as large as your average aristocratic kitchen at the time. You can still see there the remains of 3 enormous hearths, in the corner a bread oven, and right at the top end there a cauldron for cooking meat. This cool, thick-walled building is where all the castle's supplies would have been kept. It's actually known as the Strong Tower because of the incredible stone arches on this floor and the one above. And in these rooms, the wine, the beer and the food, everything that John of Gaunt needed to keep his guests happy would have been stored. This is John of Gaunt's Great Hall, the most impressive of his renovations. Built at the end of the 14th century, it's really one of the finest buildings in England at that period. And it's built to give people a sense of his regal status and his power. This is actually the cellar of the Great Hall. There would have been columns here supporting a stone-arched ceiling. And up there, this was the floor level of the hall. There's the magnificent doorway there, carved windows, incredibly ornate, and no less than 6 fireplaces to keep that giant space nice and warm in the winter. And above each fireplace, there would have been a richly decorated tapestry, the ultimate expression of wealth, culture, and stature in 14th century England. John of Gaunt would have dined in this hall only on the most important occasions. He and his guests would have sat under one of the widest roofs of any great hall of the period. Meals served here would have been grand affairs. Gaunt would have had his own company of musicians who may have played from a minstrel's gallery. This was the perfect place to entertain, and that's why 200 years later, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, didn't alter it when he was expecting the most important guest of all, the Queen of England. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was Elizabeth I's favourite courtier, and the Queen had granted him the castle in 1563. He lavished fortunes on converting it into a palace fit to receive her and the court. The tower block known as Leicester's Building is about the size of a 4-storey country mansion and was built in 1571 specifically to provide private accommodation for Elizabeth and her close servants. Dudley had known Elizabeth since childhood, and their courtship had been ongoing since 1559. The Queen came to Kenilworth 4 times. During her 1575 visit, Leicester hoped to tempt the Queen into marriage, and no expense was spared trying to impress her. Unfortunately, none of the floors have survived in Leicester's building, but Elizabeth's bedroom and withdrawing chamber would have been 2 floors up where that large middle window is. You can still see the evidence of her quarters on the walls. Knowing how much the Queen loved to dance, Dudley even built a private dancing chamber for her, which was up there on the top floor. Leicester's Elizabethan buildings were of an extraordinary height, as you can see. You can just imagine how grand this towering mansion would have looked with friezes on the walls and roaring fires. Robert Laneham, one of Dudley's ushers, described the tower during Elizabeth's visit. In daytime on every side so glittering by glass, at night by continual brightness of candle, fire and torchlight transparent through the lights and windows. For the Queen's 19-day visit in 1575, Dudley created a magnificent private garden with a 20-foot-high aviary, ornate borders and fountains. And the entrance is just through here in this specially constructed corridor. Can you describe what it would be like if we were standing here all those years ago looking out over this garden?
Well, it would have been a very scented garden and also very colourful. The whole point of this was to show off the colour of the flowers that were available at the time. The richer you were, the more flowers you could afford. And so that's the whole point of this garden, which was built for the Queen. She would have come down through this entrance, and the garden is meant to be viewed from above initially. So the terrace is very high and quite narrow. The 2 arbours at either end were designed to have views out over the base court and also the view over the mere, which was the other side. And then, of course, the 4 quarters were very Italianate in their origins. The Italian garden and the French gardens were very fashionable at the time, but they had an English twist to them.
And what was Dudley trying to achieve by building this incredible garden?
Well, he was trying to show Elizabeth that he had the wealth and he had the connections to make something like this, as well as showing off Kenilworth itself.
So you're reconstructing the garden, but how do you know what was here?
We found the foundations of the original fountain. It would have stood right in the middle and the four quarters placed around it. A lot of research has been done on gardens in England at this time and also those on the continent. There are very few still in existence, but we do have drawings, sketches, etchings and paintings of the gardens at the time, and of course many people wrote about them. So we have a letter from a man who was here for the entire visit of Her Majesty, and he gives us in his letter a very detailed account of exactly what was here, the structures, the aviary, the fountain especially, and also things like the size of the garden, the height of the terrace, the length and the breadth of it as well.
This is Leicester's Gatehouse, built by him between 1570 and 1575. It became the new grand and noble entrance to the castle. It was converted into a substantial house after 1650, but many of Leicester's original features remain. This porch, with its classical frontispiece, is part of Leicester's distinctive architectural style, also echoed in Leicester's other buildings. But he's left his mark in a more direct way too. You can see the initials RL on either side of this grand entrance. Inside, with its Elizabethan panelling and fine alabaster fireplace, this room really gives you a sense of what important houses were like during this period. The fantastic ornate fireplace was probably relocated here after 1650 from elsewhere in the castle. Again, you can see Leicester's initials RL on either side, but this time he's also included the date, 1571. In the centre here is the motto and the badges of the Order of the Garter, of which Leicester was a knight. And above you can see E and R for Elizabeth Regina on a wooden overmantel, a reference to Leicester's queen and his love. But despite all Leicester's extravagant plans and the glorious setting, the queen never gave in to his marriage entreaties. Well, that's the end of our visit to Kenilworth. I hope you've enjoyed it.